Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to our two excellent speakers today. Either of you are worth the price of admission, and I think together we've really enjoyed your talks, and you've, for me especially, made me think a lot, because my daily job is trying to tell the stories of all Canadians. But some words that I've heard today are really bouncing around in my head. Testify, telling stories versus telling history. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today, to start off, is that idea of whether the actual term women's history is so limiting that it's actually impeding the telling of women's stories, and is there a difference? Because I think about, as you were saying about your publisher saying, oh good, you're writing about a man, now we're going to sell books. Just recently, the Minnesota Lynx won the women's NBA championship. You didn't even see it on the news. And so I think there's still a disconnect today, no matter how far the journey has come. There's a disconnect to whether women's stories are appealing to all. So first off, just when you're saying you're telling women's stories, what exactly do you mean? Say, we'd start us off, Charlotte. What do you mean when you're saying that versus women's history with uppercase?
I see myself very much as a biographer, which gives me the out of saying, I want to convince my readers that the person they're reading about is both important in the larger scale of things, but also fascinating because you can get inside them. Unlike Lawrence, I'm not a novelist, I'm a non-fiction writer, which means, unlike Lawrence, I can't make things up. But I can speculate, as long as I label the speculation. And because, as I started my presentation saying I'm a commercial writer, and not an academic writer, I really do have to bring my readers into the story. It's not analysis-based, it's usually narrative-based. So when you ask me women's stories versus women's history, I would say that women's history can become a bit of a ghetto if you keep it too far out of the more general context of the social context in which the person was living. And also, if you import too many of present-day assumptions about oppression into it. But on the other hand, you must never, ever just tell a story without allowing your reader to understand things were different back then. We'd probably hate to have lived then, but this is why it happened that way.
Lawrence, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, in addition to being Charlotte's friend, I've seen you coming out of the archives on Wellington Street, and I have a sense at least of how hard you work. And of course, it's a good thing that I get to make things up because I'm not the researcher that you are. But I was wondering if you find sometimes in your own research the occasional aha moment where you find something you didn't know before, or a detail that just excites you and think, there is something that I can sort of sell to a reader and to a grander public, because we do both have the same preoccupation. We live by our words, we don't have other work, and so we have to think not only about things that make us passionate, but things that we hope will excite a broader public. So do you sometimes have those moments in archives where you come across something that just electrifies you and you think, yes, this is a connection I can make with a broader reader?
I love those moments. They can make 2 weeks of going blind in front of microfilm worth it. And often though, I haven't even realized as I'm reading the microfilm and typing everything that I think that's useful that I'm reading, I haven't even realized that I've had one of those moments, because you're so immersed in the detail and doing the research. And then you walk out of the archives, you meet wonderful people on the steps like Lawrence, but you walk home or you get the bus and something's niggling in your brain. And I'll give you an example. I was reading about Carrie Davis and what was happening to her day by day while she was in the Don jail in Toronto in 1915, having been arrested for murder. And I read that she had been visited by 2 doctors. So I type it out and go on with the chronology of what else was happening in her. And then a week later, part of the absolutely crucial evidence in her trial is that a doctor testified she was a virgin. And slowly, the light bulb came on. The two doctors had gone to the jail to examine her, to see whether she was a virgin. And I closed my mind and I imagined that scene, and I knew enough about it because you can imagine it if you've ever been to a museum of medical implements, which I have, so you know the implements they used. And that was a total aha moment, which took a while, as I said, for me to put the pieces together. And I realized then that these two male doctors had gone to this terrified 17-year-old girl and stuck their fingers in her. I mean, how horrifying is that? And it never struck anybody at the time that there was anything wrong with her being examined in this incredibly intrusive way. And it was only when I realized, and I checked around with historians who have done historians of medicine, and they confirmed, yes, that's what would have happened, did I realize not only that this was a detail that shocked and horrified me, but that on the page, it was really going to captivate readers.
When, again, that word testify comes, and I think about some of the best women's stories, they always seem to me to be calls to action to some way, speaking to something a bit larger, in a different way than, say, if a man is writing about a man. If I love Jack Granatstein, if Jack Granatstein is writing about a general, we don't call that men's history and a call to action to somehow learn them. You know what I'm saying? Whereas a lot of the best stories are the ones that capture you. They make you feel something and I always look at the word connection. For all of you who've studied women's history, who feel like they are feminists or allies, as in Lawrence's case, how important is that call to action in your storytelling to have it make some sort of difference?
Why did you choose a woman to carry your story?
Well, I didn't really meditate on anybody else but a woman. I just knew when I started to imagine that story that the best vehicle, to tell the story would be a woman. I think often as a writer of drama, of fiction, that you're looking to tell a story from the point of view of the person who has the most to lose. That's the most riveting narrative standpoint, often. And there's this amazing short story called Barn Burning by William Faulkner that's told from the point of view of a child who's witnessing his father being brought to court for terrorizing neighbors and farm communities in Mississippi, but because it's told from the standpoint of a child watching his father brought to justice, it gains its power. And so the perspective of the storyteller lends so much to the story. So I just felt that, although obviously men have suffered profoundly in the case of the transatlantic slave trade too, I just felt that the woman was the best person to deliver the story that I had in mind. I was imagining a person who would catch babies, but who would lose her own. And it was just an entirely a woman's story that was bubbling up inside me. And it wasn't really an intellectual decision. It was from the gut. This is the best person to tell this story. That's what I felt.
Danielle, just to jump in, as the historian laureate of Edmonton, your job is to take history and translate it, if you will, to the public so that they are captivated and engaged by this. And in your own books that you've done, where you've done the history of bush pilots and all this macho daring do that Charlotte speaks of, I wonder, from your perspective, in terms of that challenge of connecting with the public, what clearly everyone here is so passionate about, what are some of the keys that you see in really making people care about women's stories?
Well, can you hear me? It's good. I think everything I do is a call to action, actually, and because my mission statement is one around social justice and inclusivity and diversity and equity, I go out and I look for the hidden stories, and I try and connect people with them, because not only is that, I think, the way to get people of all ages interested in history, which, I think we're all fans of here, but it is a way to help to tell those stories and to create a better society. And I do think that men have been the universal for so long, and that publishers will see a male author, a male character, as something that will appeal to both genders, both sexes, and that women's words and stories have been sent to a pink ghetto chick lit. I mean, God, you slap a pink cover on something, and even though you could have a domestic story told by Jonathan Franzen that's going to sell millions to people of all backgrounds. So I think it is a challenge to overcome this idea that if a story is coming from a woman, that it will appeal. But I have talked to Chris Hadfield and I've talked to Roberta Bondar, and they both have pretty awesome stories. And I think that you would be hard-pressed to differentiate between some of the struggles that they've gone through and the inspirational qualities of their work.
Now, Charlotte, you mentioned in your talk about the lack of primary sources. For those of you who aren't professional writers or professional historians and aren't like Lawrence and can make it up, and I know you did lots of research, so that's tongue-in-cheek. History used to be chronological. This happened and this happened. Typically it was a great man that charged up a hill or ran down the other side, and they all kept lengthy journals and puffed their pipes and harumphed and left their memoirs behind. Winston Churchill probably has the longest memoirs in the world. As you explain, a lot of the women's writing is lost to time. What little remains is a treasure. And when you wrote Carrie Davis's story, you literally, like Lawrence, had to bring this, in a way, flesh her out of your own mind. I wonder, how do you overcome that limitation of the lack of primary? How do you walk a mile in their shoes so that you can do them justice as you say you want to do?
I have to say that this is why fiction is so valuable, and in fact I'm so grateful to people like Lawrence for giving us stories that are really embedded in fact but brought alive by his imagination, because there really isn't enough primary material, and only fiction can cover the voices of the dispossessed, whether it's slaves or women. I say only fiction can cover the voices, but history, of course, can always cover the events. Or as a historian, you can find arm's length accounts of events which involve women, and then you turn to wonderful writers, wonderful fiction writers. Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace, for example, I think is perhaps one of the most wonderful books about 19th century Canada that exists. But how do you discover, how do you reveal the lives of those who didn't leave primary sources? Unless a fiction writer gets interested in them, I'm afraid they're forgotten. There are so many forgotten lives. We could never remember or write about them all anyway. You just have to hope that enough material has survived, that you can disinter a few to tell a larger story. And by the way, writers of non-fiction are so grateful when families not only save their family papers, but also label them and give them to archives. And if you could all, when you go home, please open the drawer where you put all your family photos and write on the back of them who everybody is. It would be of great help to future historians.
I have to add, my parents and a few friends co-founded the Ontario Black History Society in 1978, and I was still in university at the time, but I became a volunteer, and one of my jobs was to sort of head up this oral history project. And it was such a great thing to do, and so basically we were just sent out into the Black community to interview elderly people, including many women, who would just tell us their stories, and we'd have a tape recorder running, and later on get those stories transcribed, and they were just the richest and most fascinating stories of particularly sort of mid-20th century black women, you know, who had whole lives to tell, whose stories would otherwise have been forgotten. So I'm a great believer in oral history, in the merging of oral histories and women's histories.
Can I jump into?
Yes, of course.
I do a lot of oral history work as well, and so if you're talking about the more recent past, that is such a fantastic way. You know, grab the oldest person in your family along with those photos and sit down with a tape recorder. But then also, it's amazing sometimes what material culture can tell us. And I grew up and was trained in more of the academic tradition of archives and interviews, but my colleagues at the University of Alberta who work with material, things like dresses, or implements for the kitchen or the backyard, you know, these kind of things can tell us a lot. Building history, you know, how different buildings and parts of cities are used. I mean, those are some really interesting clues into the past. And I think also a lot of us now who work more in creative nonfiction, literary nonfiction, those terms get tossed around a lot. We do some imagining, we do some creative, always indicated, and in my case, still often endnoted, because I love those. So I think there are ways to overcome that, but often you are reading against the grain. You are reading through those filters with newspaper reports, and sometimes you do get those gold moments, like I did at the Yukon Archives, where, you know, just you find someone's letter and you go, oh my God, and that's great. So you got to keep digging.
Thank you. Now, one of the things also that strikes me, and this was a theme as well in both of your speeches, but just in general, is the danger of oversimplifying what actually happened. And I think a lot of Canadians as well, if you do read a little bit of history, you have a sense of, oh, that's how it unfolded, and it's over. And so, you know, if Joan Sangster could be here, she wrote a chapter in our latest book, Canada's Great War Album, about the experience of women in World War I. The twists and turns that women went through, and the idea that it's just a straight line march to equality. It's not true. It was zig. It was zag. We recently in our magazine had a story about suffrage. Lo and behold, I discovered that women in Quebec in the 1800s could vote. In fact, it was a Mrs. Papineau that voted, and there was her grandson that took her right to vote away. This amazing story in Quebec that I didn't know about. And so I guess one of the things, you know, there were so many aspects of the same story. Suffrage for Aboriginal women, suffrage for rich women versus poor women. How do you navigate that water so that your narrative actually, again, does justice for all of the facets of the women's experience and not just telling one linear story that everyone, one size fits all history?
Actually, the past is a complete ocean of facts where you just can never, ever, ever cover everything, even in the tiny little section of the past that you've chosen to write about. It's always selective. The story that you build, it's always going to be selecting some facts and ignoring others. And you're kidding yourself if you ever think there's a definitive history, because it's not going to be that way. And as a writer, you have to actually not just select the facts that tell the story you want to tell, but also give them a coherence, which they never had to people at the time. When we think of 1913 today, we think, oh, it must have been awful, the shadow of war. In fact, 1913 was a year of, if you read European histories, the sun shone all summer. It was a delightful time. Economies in Europe were booming. Yes, there was some trouble in Central Europe, but there'd been trouble in Central Europe since the turn of the century. Nobody saw what was coming. But now, looking backwards, we understand that that was a year in a much longer and gloomier continuum. History is, if you're a history storyteller, if you do narrative history, it's never ever going to be complete. It's never going to be definitive. And you just have to find your story, which involves such artificial constructs as a beginning, a middle, an end, a plot, and dramatic arc, characters that you build up to keep your readers with you. And you just have to be as honest as you can, so you don't actually omit a really crucial detail, like somebody was married, or so the law had changed. But you are constantly navigating your own personal bias in what you think is interesting, your obligation to the past to be as truthful as you can without just getting overweighed by facts, and also your obligation to your publisher to come in on deadline at less than 100,000 words.
Well, surely, Danielle and Charlotte, you've both been frustrated at times when people come to you and say, well, why didn't you write this? Why didn't you put that in your essay or your book? But I so much agree, you can't do everything.
It does happen to be a lot, especially with the aviation history. You know, Mark mentioned the last book I wrote was called Polar Winds, A Century of Flying the North. So that was crazy, trying to pack in 100 years in a giant geographic area. And the traditional stories have been about wonderful people like Max Ward and Wap May and, you know, those sort of mythic macho bush pilots. And of course they make an appearance, but what I wanted to know is, well, what were happening with Indigenous pilots, with pilots of color, with baggage handlers, you know, all around passengers. And so I have had a couple of people come up to me and say, well, you know, you kind of changed things around on me here. But I came up through university where we had our Venn diagram of race, class, and gender, and now I've added colonialism and ableism and all these other things. And so luckily with that book, I was able to bring in people like Edith Josie from Old Crow or Elsie McGill, and help to round out some of the stories. And sometimes you let down people, but I hope that it's a good challenge. I hope that it brings them along a little bit in their journey.
I'm glad you guys brought this up, because one of the other things, Lawrence, one of the books that you did was more of an essay. I'm going to get the title wrong, but it's Dear Sir, I'm Going to Burn Your Book. Is that the right title?
It was called Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book.
I Intend to Burn Your Book. Women's stories in general, but I think there are lots of stories in the Canadian mosaic that no one wants to hear or didn't want to hear, or it hurts to hear. It makes us feel uncomfortable. It's best to put it over there and let's just keep moving on. The future's bright, the future's shiny, the past is dim. Can you just walk us through briefly a little bit about what it was like to have someone react so vociferously against what you had written, to the point where they really would have preferred you to just keep quiet and not write that at all?
Well, Mark's referring to an incident in Amsterdam a few years ago when a small group of Dutch people of Surinamese descent, keeping in mind, of course, that the Dutch practiced slavery, you know, in Suriname and Curacao. So there are people descending from Dutch slaves in Suriname and Curacao who now live in the Netherlands in good number, and who are very conscious of a history of colonialism and racism, you know, in the Netherlands too. And so, although I've been well received there, and the Book of Negroes was a bestseller in the Netherlands, it was translated directly, the title from the English-Canadian title of the Book of Negroes into Dutch, and a small group of Dutch Surinamese were so outraged by the use of the word Negro in Dutch in the Dutch title that they decided, without reading the book and vowing never to read it or to open it, to burn it, you know, in a park in Amsterdam, dedicated to commemorating the history of the abolition of the Dutch slave trade. So that was a context that, you know, just underneath your question, so people could know what it was all about. And it was hard. I mean, I think we've all discovered, if we write history or if we write anything that's socially engaged, that the hardest people to please are your own family And the second hardest people to please are your own community, the community you come from. If you happen to be a Jewish Canadian writer, or a black writer, or a Ukrainian Canadian writer, you're likely going to find more challenges, in your own communities than you will in the broader community. So it was particularly painful when a small group of black Dutch chose to be so offended by the title that they decided to burn the book, in a bonfire while TV cameras rolled and my publisher's life was threatened. It was hard to watch that, and it was hard to lose an audience I would normally hope to gain. But you can't win them all, and if you write a book and stand up and declare, your values and put them down in some form of art on the page, and you sort of have to take the good with the bad and the bad with the good. And I've had a lot of good and a lot of fortune, so sometimes you just have to sort of suck it up and dig down and keep going. But it did give me a book to write, an essay in which I chose to examine more deeply the roots of the anger that led to the burning of the book, and how I sort of come to grips with it intellectually.
There's also, what goes through my mind is this idea that when women of the past were fighting, and I mean literally fighting, metaphorically fighting, but literally fighting for their rights. One of the other things I discovered recently was we did an article about the, suffrage, and in Manitoba, Nellie McClung looms large. Almost to the point where she, for instance, eclipses all others. She's the only suffragist that anyone can instantly say. I was drawn to the story of Amelia Burritt, who in her 90s collected more than 4,000, went door to door collecting more than 4,000 signatures and presented them to the Premier, and was able to vote at the age of 98 for the first time. And it was amazing. I wish I could have went out drinking with her. I mean, she would have been in great company, I'm sure. She seemed quite feisty, and she went deeper beyond the ideas of what we know into getting more diversity in these stories and the multitude of stories out there. How important is that we just don't stop with Nellie McClung or even just the famous five, that there are multitudes of women's stories out there that we just may never ever get a chance to know?
I'm actually thrilled to hear that you found your own personal heroine, and I'm just hoping that you're going to write her story, if you haven't already, so that others can have access to it. But honestly, Mark, the more I write, the more I realize how little history most Canadians know. We are a nation of amnesiacs who are so busy looking ahead, we don't even realize that where we're going is shaped by where we've been, where we've come from. And in the book I'm writing right now, Who Do We Think We Are? I've written, I'm just finishing it, and I've written about a series of people, including well-known people like Tommy Douglas, Margaret Atwood, Georges-Étienne Cartier. But I have actually been quite horrified as I run through the list with different groups, how many people have not heard of some of the other people I've written about in this book, including Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police, Harold Innis, the great historian of the 1930s who wrote The Fur Trade of Canada. Ask anybody below a certain age, I don't know what it would be, 30, and you're really lucky if you get one hand raised as to knowing who Harold Innis is. Bertha Wilson, alive in our lifetime, and yet many people can't identify who she was. We have so much groundwork to do, just making sure that the headliners are remembered. That yes, we need to dig deeper, yes, we need to find more people and write their stories and record their stories, but also we've just got a lot of elementary history to spread about and to build an audience for.
I'm glad again that you said that, because I was looking at Lawrence and I thought to myself, why do we know more about Rosa Parks than we do about Mary Shad Carey?
Or more about Rosa Parks than about Violet Desmond.
Why? What is inducing this amnesia, this national amnesia?
Well, you do have to hand it to the Americans in some respect, and my parents were Americans who became very proud Canadians, but I think Americans, do a better job of celebrating their history and don't shrink away from it, as much as we do. But I do believe that many Canadians still feel that Canadian history and women's history and Black history too, by the way, is essentially boring, and we still have to fight against that sort of tide of resentment. Why must we go back into Canadian history again? It's always going to be an uphill struggle for me. Have you found that too?
Well, I have to say that I think Canadian historians have done an extraordinarily good job in suppressing gossip. If you
that's no fun, by the way. We got to stop that suppression. Please stop.
If you read anything about the founding fathers in the States, you can learn an extraordinary amount about their personal lives, and who had slaves, who had mistresses, what the marriages were like. There's no fear that, in fact, if you reveal somebody's private life, you're in some ways diminishing their public life. Okay, Canada. Georges-Étienne Cartier, brilliant at building this country, helping John A. Macdonald secure the British North American Act by ensuring that it was a federal system so that Quebec's interests would be protected, the French language, the French culture. How many people know that, in fact, he was an absolutely master of balancing different forces within the country and within his own life? He had a terribly proper bourgeois wife and 2 well-dressed little girls. He also had a mistress who dressed in pants and smoked cigars and regularly accompanied him to official functions. This has not appeared in many books. Suddenly that sort of stocky man with silver hair and a rather truculent expression becomes a whole lot more interesting when you realize he had a private life. He balanced 2 different conventions within his private life. He balanced 2 different language groups within his public life. Isn't that a more interesting way of thinking about him than just looking at a picture on a stamp?
It's about, yeah, exactly. It's about seeing them as humans in a way. Like one of the things, I guess, we have to wrap up soon, and I do have a question I want to end with. But I think one of the things I wonder and almost lament is, will we ever get to a point in society where women's history is just history? It's not women's history or Black history or Aboriginal history, therefore of interest only to women, Black Canadians or Aboriginals, or West Coast history or East Coast history. Do you literally see a day in which we can sit here on stage and go, wasn't that funny that we had to talk about women's history? As if it was some strange thing that no one else could ever get.
I hope so.
Well, actually, no, I hope not. I mean, why? There are so many different kinds of history that I think, actually, that in some ways it's almost, we're almost accepted now as women's history. But there's military history, there's social history, there's Black history, there's Aboriginal history. I don't want one big sludge of history. I want different stories giving me different perspectives on the past. So will we ever not feel an obligation to recognize women's history? I hope that never happens. We certainly want to keep it going, tell those stories. I think perhaps what you're really talking about is that, that we somehow have to regard it as special in a way that other kinds of history are not. That it sort of needs its own little sort of nurturing garden with lots of fertilizer over here because we haven't had enough of it. I hope we're coming through that patch, because it's true that we needed to pay attention. But I think, we do pay attention now, but I sure don't want it just to disappear into the sludge of Canadian history.
I guess what I was looking at, and thank you for clarifying, what I was hoping for is that eventually all Canadians will see the worth in it, that it just is considered Canadian history. But to finish off, because we could literally talk all day, I just want everyone to go down the line here, and this is more of a personal question. Women from the past have influenced us in writ large. Nellie McClung may be an inspiration. Who in your own life, what woman in your own life has inspired you? Who on a personal basis is someone that you you've actually drawn some inspiration from?
Oh, the sacrificial lamb up here. I'm actually going to say someone that I just met earlier this year. Her name is Miranda Jimmy, and she's an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, and she is one of the bravest people I know, and has started Reconciliation in Solidarity Edmonton, and I'm very proud to know her and to be learning our history, our collective history with her.
Charlotte?
One person who I feel has a wonderful grasp on the importance of women in politics and in history is Monique Bégin, who is a strong feminist, but in fact never would probably describe herself as a humanist, because she really does see every question as how it belongs within the larger context of Canadian society. It's about women, but it's about so much more than women, and she's not. And she treated in her own time, when she was one of the very, very rare women in politics, she treated the unbelievable amount of sexism that she met with terrific good humor, and was so effective by just laughing at it, ignoring it, and just keeping going.
Thank you. Lawrence?
Well, it's such a complicated question, and there's so many different ways that I guess we could all take it. On a personal note, of course, I have to think of my mother, because she was in the trenches fighting for civil rights in the States and Canada long before my father was doing work for which he became nationally famous. While he was still a PhD student at the U of T, she was going out to prove instances of racial discrimination in Ontario and trying to persuade the government to enact anti-discrimination legislation. So she was in the field years before he was, but he got all the credit, as she moved into unfortunately for her, into a more domestic life, as mother and housewife, as she started raising children. And that was always a supreme frustration to her, that she never really got to live, a big life, out in the world the way he did. So my mother, for sure, and also she encouraged me so much in so many ways to write, by reading to us as children and exciting us about the playfulness of language by reading to us. But on a more public way, just so I can kind of connect perhaps a bit better with the audience, there are so many women I could refer to, but maybe just for fun, I'll mention one who's become a friend as well as a very public figure, and that's Margaret Atwood. And I think one of the things I admire so much about Margaret is that she's utterly fearless. She has no time for bullshit or niceties, and she just goes straight to the jugular with what she believes in. And she's, by the way, been extraordinarily generous to Canadian writers and to the world of Canadian literature in every respect imaginable, intellectually, financially, and so forth, politically. But one day, I was at a black tie event. I suspect, Charlotte, you were there too. It was one of the annual Writers' Trust events in Toronto to raise money for the Writers' Trust of Canada. And Margaret and her husband Graham were there, and it was in a fancy hotel in Toronto, and it was a fancy dinner, and Margaret and Graham had brought back lunches to eat at this fancy hotel dinner in black tie and in evening gowns. And it's because they disagreed with the management policies of the hotel. So although they were coming to celebrate writers and Canadian writers, they refused to eat the food served by the hotel, so they brought their own lunches in bags to make a statement. That is Margaret Atwood. And so I admire her courage, her activism, her energy, how prolific she is, and how fearless she is in advocating the things that she believes in so profoundly.
Well, I just want to say, before I say thank you to everyone, just to let everybody know, this is not the end of a conversation, it's the beginning of a conversation. And so I'm happy to also say, in our magazine, Canada's History magazine, our February issue is going to be on great women. We're going to be profiling 20 great women from the past as chosen by Charlotte Gray and a panel of other prominent Canadian women. So we're really excited about this, and we're also going to have an online function where women and men can go online and nominate the women that they think have made a significant impact on Canada. So on behalf of Canada's History Society, I want to say thank you to Danielle, Charlotte, and Lawrence for having, I think, a really interesting discussion and hopefully sending us all home with a lot to think about. So thank you very much.